Pleasure to introduce our presenter, John Cohen. He holds the distinguished position of senior correspondent at Science, which he started writing for in 1990 and has published widely in other magazines and newspapers, including the Washington City paper, where he was senior editor from 1986 to 1990. Mr. Cohen obtained his bachelor's degree in science writing from the University of California, San Diego in 1981. He specializes in biomedicine and has long focused on HIV/AIDS, other infectious diseases, immunology, vaccines, and global health. He has also reported extensively on genetics, primate research, evolution, bioterrorism, research funding, ethics, reproductive biology, credit battles, and the media itself. Mr. Cohen has had an illustrious career that spans more than 3 decades. His articles have appeared in multiple reputable journals, including The New Yorker, Smithsonian, Atlantic Monthly, and the New York Times Magazine. He's the author of 4 books and has produced many documentaries for Science. Notably, he contributed to The End of AIDS, a 6-part series that ran on PBS NewsHour in July 2016, won a National Emmy for News and Documentary from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and won first place in the 2017 Communications Award for Film, TV, Radio from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to John Cohen as he gives a presentation on Following the Virus.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I owe a lot of people here a debt of gratitude. They welcomed me when I was here 2018, was it? Or I think last year. We did a series for PBS, and I'm deeply grateful to all of you who helped us do that. I have called this Following the Virus because Watergate-era journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, came up with the motto, follow the money. And that was how they did their reporting. My career has largely been about following HIV. And I'll take you through it. I'm going to weave in my personal story with the story of the epidemic. And I also want to show off this watercolor of HIV. These are 2 viruses by a structural biologist at Scripps, whose name is David Goodsell, and I have a story coming out about him either today or tomorrow in Science, because he's one of the few scientists I've met whose artwork actually reflects his own research. These are perfectly scaled viruses, and he does many viruses and bacteria. He makes this stuff available to the public. I'd encourage you to look up his work if you ever need to illustrate anything, because I think his watercolors are spectacular. I also want to give you a sense of what I do. This is what I did in November and December of this year. Much of it has nothing to do with HIV. I did a story about surfing wetsuits. I did a story about contaminated lettuce. I cover CRISPR for Science, the genome editor. I did a story about hepatitis B. I did a story about antibodies for flu. I cover Ebola also. And I did a story about UN/AIDS. And this is all just in 6 weeks. So I don't want you to think that all I do is HIV. My mandate is much broader. One of the reasons I've covered HIV for so long is because it intersects with so many interesting things. And so I just made a word cloud of the things that I thought interested me about HIV. And it's just taken me so many places. And it also has allowed me to travel the world. I've been probably in more than 50 countries at this point covering HIV, and I travel as the anti-tourist. I go everywhere a tourist never goes, because that's where the virus takes me. HIV surfaces, the AIDS epidemic, not HIV, the AIDS epidemic surfaces in June of 1981 in MMWR. There are 11 MMWR reports by September of 1982. But this is our White House in October of 1982. This is the White House press room. Larry Speaks is the press spokesperson, the Huckabee of the day. Larry, does the president have any reaction to the announcement the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic and have over 600 cases? Mr. Speaks, what's AIDS? Over a third of them have died. It's known as gay plague. Laughter. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died. And I wondered if the president is aware of it. Mr. Speaks, I don't have it. Do you? Laughter. This is how our White House dealt with the epidemic. after there had been 11 reports in MMWR. That's really how our country responded. And I dug these up at the Reagan Library. These are in the opening of my book, Shots in the Dark. It goes on, and I pull out transcripts like this that stay with this jocular manner for another couple of years. That's how the Reagan White House addressed this. And one of the things that fascinated me was contrasting this with polio, where the president had the disease, where the president started the March of Dimes. This is how the Reagan administration dealt with it. In April of 1984, there's a press conference to announce that the probable cause of AIDS has been found, Robert Gallo, with Secretary Margaret Heckler. It's a famous press conference for several reasons. One, because there's tension about who discovered the virus, because a year earlier, the French group led by Luc Montagnier and Françoise Barré-Sinousset had published in Science a putative cause, but they didn't have probable evidence. And there was a controversy the day before the press conference because the New York Times writes about the tension between the groups. And Heckler famously says at this press conference, when asked, when will we have a vaccine, that we hope to have such a vaccine ready for testing in approximately 2 years. Many people who talk about that statement say that she said we would have a vaccine in 2 years. That's not what she said. She said we'd have one ready for testing. And she was right. Many people made a goat out of her for saying that it was overly optimistic. But actually in 1986, it was revealed that a secret test was taking place in Zaire. Daniel Zaguri from France had staged a vaccine trial with the collaboration of Mbuto, the president of the country, and it was a heavily criticized vaccine trial after the fact. He did not receive the proper permissions to use the reagents he used, and he did actually suffer many problems because of it. My interest at this point in time, in 1986, was pretty marginal. I read the book Breakthrough when I'm 60 years old. When I was 10 years old, I read the book Breakthrough and wrote a book report about it. It's the saga of Jonas Salk. So I knew the polio vaccine story very well. And that was my basis for my undergraduate major in science writing. I wrote about Jonas Salk and the controversy between Salk and Sabin and the OPV, IPV debate. And one thing that I loved was when this vaccine was proven to work in April of 1955, the largest clinical trial ever conducted at that point. The writer for the New York Times wrote, "The world learned today that its hopes for finding an effective weapon against paralytic polio had been realized." And I read that sentence, and I loved the sentence. And I wanted to write that sentence about something in my life. It was just a dream of mine. In 1987, the US and France end their fight between Gallo and Montagnier, with President Jacques Chirac meeting with Ronald Reagan in the White House, and Jonas Salk, it turns out, which I've highlighted here, was the mediator. He brokered the deal. And at this point, I knew Jonas Salk fairly well because part of my undergraduate major at UCSD, he was across the street at the Salk Institute, and I pestered him, and he agreed to allow me to interview him repeatedly. So I took note of that he was involved. But I still wasn't really involved in HIV/AIDS coverage. I did edit a writer who covered the 1987 International Conference in Washington, D.C., because I was an editor at a newspaper there. I did do a story where I went into a prison with a guy who demonstrated to prisoners how to properly use condoms. But I wasn't covering HIV. I was covering anything but science in many ways. I was covering Washington, D.C. And then I read a story in 1989 that Jonas Salk was working on an AIDS vaccine. And he was collaborating with a guy at the NIH. And I thought, well, I'll give the guy a call. I'll go meet with him, see what they're doing. Just because I had this fascination with polio and Salk. And I went and met with the guy, and it turned into a story. And this was the story I did in 1989. It was called Shots in the Dark, which became the name of my book. And it was basically a story about how Salk and this guy, Joe Gibbs, were pushing a vaccine idea that mirrored the OPV-IPV debate. And essentially that debate, if you don't know it, was about a whole-killed vaccine versus a live attenuated vaccine. And Salk argued that the whole killed would work just as well, if not better than the live vaccine. And that was Salk's life mission, was to forward that idea that you didn't have to have a live replicating attenuated virus to have potent protection against polio. And he was arguing that a killed vaccine could work for HIV. So I wrote a story about this, Salk in opposition, basically, to the orthodoxy of HIV vaccine research at the time. I quoted a guy named Ron DeRosier in the story. Curiously, Dr. Ronald DeRosier, the first SIV vaccine researcher to successfully protect animals from that virus and publish his findings, is a resolute skeptic. I have hope, but I have my doubts that we're ever going to make a vaccine, says DeRosier. I don't think an inactivated whole virus vaccine is going to be practical in humans, says DeRosier. DeRosier, an uncommon candor for a scientist, calls his experiments highly artificial, explaining that he did everything he could without cheating to arrive at positive results. It's highly unlikely that there's any chance in hell it would work in the real world, he said. So that's 1989. He was pretty perspicacious, I think. So I write this story, and a book agent calls and says, "Hey, do you have any interest in writing a book?" I come up with possibly the stupidest idea for a book in the history of science writing, 1 year in the search for an AIDS vaccine. And a publisher likes the idea, remarkably, and I sell this book. In 1990, my wife and I had our first child. I stopped working, I quit my job to write this book, and I wrote 3 or 4 chapters. The publisher loved them, and my book was essentially arguing that Salk was right, the whole killed HIV vaccine was the way to go. And about 6, 7 months into it, I interviewed Robert Gallo, who said to me, "John, this year that you're so concerned about," and this echoed in my head that the year had absolutely no meaning to anyone I was interviewing, that it was a completely artificial construct, and it was stupid. And I hated the book. I suddenly couldn't write the book. And I called, my wife was upset that I wasn't making money. We had a baby. I was suddenly working on a book that I hated. And I called Science Magazine out of the blue because I had learned a detail that I thought would make a good news story about the AIDS conference being moved from Boston to Italy because of our immigration law in the United States. And the editor who took the phone happened to be a top editor. He liked my idea. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know my degree, anything about me. That's how I started writing for Science Magazine. He took the call. I wrote the story. He liked the story. He asked me if I had more ideas. The next thing I knew, I was an HIV/AIDS reporter, which wasn't my intent. My intent was to spend 1 year on the book and go back to my life. I think it's important to recognize what the world was in 1990. There was no HIV to speak of in South Africa. South Africa today has 7 million of the 37 million or so infections in the world, far more than any country. But there was no HIV in Southern Africa at that point in time. 1990, I went to this protest at the National Institutes of Health that ACT UP organized. This is in front of Building 1 at the NIH. They shut down the NIH. They shut down the FDA. They shut down Wall Street. There was incredible anger and frustration from people living with HIV who were dying young. And the developing world was really not on the agenda. It wasn't discussed very much. There was a recognition that there was a heterosexual epidemic taking place. But the activist world really focused on the US and Europe, and the anger that was boiling over was really geared toward helping these people. In the absence of solutions, in the absence of any real way to help people, the first drug that came to market, AZT, comes to market in '87, and it's only extending life by about 18 months. And in the absence of this, there's a tremendous amount of controversy swirling around HIV, which gives me plenty to write about. There's a US immigration ban. There's the GP160 vaccine trials, which was, GP160 is the protein on the surface, if you don't know, and there was a vaccine trial that was pushed through, funding for it was pushed through Congress by a high-powered lobbying group hired by Microgenesis, a biotech company. I wrote extensively to expose the lobbying effort to push through this funding, which the research community didn't agree should be happening. Gallo versus Montagnier exploded again because John Crudson, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, did a 16 full-page story in the Chicago Tribune one Sunday, essentially arguing that Gallo stole the virus from Montagnier, which kicked open a can of worms, and it started a congressional investigation. It also linked Zachary's AIDS vaccine trial to Gallo because he got reagents from Gallo. That led to another NIH investigation. Activists were attacking big pharmaceutical companies right and left for being greedy and not doing enough. The Florida dentist case was very famous. And Peter Duesberg at Berkeley was receiving a lot of attention for claiming that HIV didn't even cause AIDS. He called the virus a pussycat. There was also growing evidence that AZT maybe even did less than people thought it did. There was a Concord trial, this was in 1993. Combinations of AZT with DDI and D4T, which many had hoped would work better, didn't seem to be doing anything. People didn't know how to, there were these enormous debates about surrogate markers and could you use a change in CD4 counts to evaluate the power of a drug. There was just tremendous confusion and controversy surrounding the field. Then the AIDS vaccine world went into a tailspin over evidence that the antibodies that they thought looked like they were working really weren't, and they had misread this. So I did a special issue for Science before the Berlin AIDS conference that summer, where I interviewed by fax machine, I think 100 or so scientists, and I asked them to rank what were the most important questions for a cure and a vaccine. This was an era called the doom and gloom era. The Berlin meeting was known as the doom and gloom meeting. And there was a call for getting back to basics. I did do a story about hidden gems at the Berlin conference and noted that Mario Stevenson of the University of Nebraska has been dissecting the AIDS virus to learn what makes it different. But then I went on to say that he was collaborating with Berlinski, who would explain what this was about in his talk. I forget what you said, but apparently it impressed me at the time. These questions that I list as the top 10 questions for cure and vaccines, some of them actually have been answered, but I would argue that most of them haven't been answered. For a cure, what causes the immune system collapse seen in AIDS? I think we know that, and I don't think that's a major question any longer. How can HIV replication be controlled? I think people would still ask that. What are the correlates of protection? It's still good questions. And then in 1994, something remarkable happens. There's actually a biomedical success that is profound. AZT is shown to work to prevent mother-to-child transmission. It works pretty well. It has one small problem. It has to be given as an intravenous drip, and it's got to be given before a woman gives birth. It's not going to work in most of the world that needs this intervention, because most of the world that needs this intervention is poor. And so I do a story in 1995 about bringing AZT to poor countries for mother-to-child transmission. Access suddenly had become an issue. There was no real access issue with AZT and DDI and D4T because they didn't work that well. So there wasn't a great clamor from poor countries to give us these drugs. In 95, Gallo's group publishes a paper about chemokines. Everyone I interviewed had never heard of chemokines. That's why I put chemo what. And it turns out to lead to the discovery of HIV using, everybody knew there were co-receptors involved to CD4, didn't know what they were, and this mystery was cracked, that CD4 was using either CCR5 or CXCR4 as the main co-receptors. And that was a major advance from a fundamental scientific perspective. And then in 96, at the CROI meeting, the Conference on Retrovirus and Opportunistic Infections, I see this slide go up. And I look at the slide, and it's the first time I've ever seen a slide where drugs truly worked. And I say to the person sitting next to me, oh, that's what it looks like when drugs work. And this is with the advent of protease inhibitors combined with existing reverse transcriptase inhibitors, and they really worked. But people were so wary. Anthony Fauci, head of NIAID, says, is this an advance? Yes, but those of us who haven't lost our long-term memories remember what happened with AZT. So that's really how the initial reception of this phenomenal breakthrough, a breakthrough that really has saved millions of lives, that's how it was initially received by many people. I then wrote an article in '96 where I refer to this guy, Mario Stevenson from the University of Nebraska, and write about his helping to develop HIV as a vector for gene therapy. And then we have to run a correction because apparently he wasn't at the University of Nebraska, as I reported. He had moved to Massachusetts. And he also was upset about something else. It was also instrumental to first showing that HIV can infect non-dividing cells. I don't know what I got wrong, but I point this out because I think one of the most frustrating things for me covering HIV around the world is the lack of self-criticism that I find in countries who just want to clap themselves on the back about what a great job they're doing. And I have come to the conclusion that if you really want to attack your HIV problem and make a serious dent in your own epidemic, you must be self-critical. I am highly self-critical, Mario, I'm sorry. I don't know what I did wrong other than calling your institution by the wrong name, but I clearly made a mistake. And I think all of us should be quick to point out our mistakes. The media in 1996 just fell in love with this breakthrough, and Time magazine named David Ho as Man of the Year. The New York Times magazine had a cover story, End of AIDS. The Newsweek had the same thing, End of AIDS. They put a question mark on it because it's very coy. I found all of this outrageous because the epidemic was exploding now in southern Africa and in many other parts of the world. It was anything but the end of AIDS. It certainly was for wealthy countries an end to young people dying from HIV. It certainly did change everything, and it deserved to be celebrated. David Ho took a lot of heat for being Man of the Year. Many researchers who were at the forefront of the epidemic thought that this was silly to have put him on the cover, and his career took a hit for it as well. Clinton, then in '97, says that in 10 years we're going to have an AIDS vaccine. He sets a moonshot goal. When I saw that, I owed a book to a publisher. I'd still been collecting string on my AIDS vaccine book for all these years, and I thought, now I have a book to write, because this AIDS vaccine search is in disarray. What Clinton has just said is ridiculous, to put a 10-year time frame on it. And so I took a leave of absence and started to work on my book shortly after this. And just as the advent of these good drugs turned the world upside down, my world got turned upside down. In 1997, I went to Africa for the first time. And I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I went to do a story about monkeypox. The world's largest outbreak of monkeypox was taking place in the center of the country, in Katakokombe, Kasai Oriental. I hired my own airplane and went there. I rode on motorbikes for days from village to village. I took blood samples. Local nurses gave me blood samples. I put them in my backpack to take them back to check to make sure they were monkeypox. It turned out that everyone I met with had chickenpox or had a resolved case of monkeypox, and I didn't meet anyone who had monkeypox, and the New York Times magazine killed the story. Heartbreaking. I got under the table and cried. But when I was in Kinshasa, I decided to do a story about Projet SIDA, the largest AIDS research program in Africa that had collapsed because of the controversy, civil war there. And I did, for the first time, I walked into wards filled with dying people, not just of HIV. First time I went to brothels and interviewed sex workers. And they had painted the word SIDA, which is AIDS, on the outside of the main research facility, the INRB, in goat blood to scare people away during the civil unrest from raiding their laboratories and stealing all their samples. And I fell deeply in love with Africa. It rocked my soul in many, many ways. And I just had the time of my life visiting a continent that I don't think I ever imagined I would go to. In '97, for me to go to Africa, I think back on, I was scared of going to Africa. All I thought about Africa was it's a dangerous place where I certainly would go and never come back. But as it turned out, it was a fantastic experience. And when I got back, I really saw with great clarity how there were two worlds. In 1998, I did the first story about eradicating HIV, the first story I did for Science about actually curing the disease. And at the same time, in the International AIDS meeting, I focused on the fact that there was actual demonstrations because prices of AIDS drugs were too expensive for people in poor countries. The drugs were working now. We could not cure people, but we could keep people alive with the drugs. And there was finally an outrage that this wasn't available to most of the world. So we really saw this division of the world into rich and poor in a way that I wasn't aware of earlier. In 2000, I was able to go to a half dozen African countries to do a special package for Science called AIDS Research in Africa. And I investigated the origins of the epidemic. On the top, it's Gabon. Those are hunters who explained to me that when they kill a chimpanzee or any big animal, a mandrill, they have to chop it up right there on the spot. And when you chop it up with this crude machete, it's so easy to see how the virus could jump from apes to humans. It became just crystalline to me that that's probably what happened. And there was a controversy at that time about whether the oral polio vaccine was responsible for triggering the epidemic, which I thought was nonsense then. I think the data now are overwhelming that it's nonsense. But I did a story about the origin, looking at a group that was studying actual monkey and ape blood samples to try to understand origins. And this was becoming a really great advance in the history of the epidemic around that time. I also went to Gulu, which is in the north of Uganda, and for the first time saw hundreds of people dying from AIDS in one ward. This is an Italian doctor working in one of those wards, holding up a TB x-ray. And it was the first time I'd really been in a place where there was lots of conflict also, because I went into places where there was civil war. On the grounds of this hospital, this woman is cooking because thousands of people came onto the hospital grounds in Gulu just to be protected from the Lord's Resistance Army, which was stealing children. And I also realized that people in Africa and hospitals don't have food many times unless family comes to the hospital and cooks for them. The inequities were tremendous. This woman is a sex worker in Pumwani, in the slum near Nairobi, and she was part of a famous study that looked at exposed uninfected people that the University of Manitoba led. There was a very serious attempt to launch new research projects. This is in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, a very sophisticated laboratory doing work. And this is in the bottom, an orphanage in Kampala. This is the study site where they first found that nevirapine worked to prevent mother-to-child transmission, a single pill given at labor to the mother and then to the child at birth, some liquid. Phenomenal advance. And this is Glenda Gray, who at the time was at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, the largest hospital I had ever been in Soweto. And she was, I called her a guerrilla researcher. She was doing a mother-to-child transmission study, but she was actually, stealing might be too strong of a word, she was keeping drug left over and giving it to pregnant women to prevent mother-to-child transmission. So this really, really, again, changed my perspective of the world. And then the AIDS conference, the International AIDS Conference, was held in Durban in the summer of 2000 for the first time ever held on the African continent. And it was a tremendous meeting. Any of you who were there, I'm sure, remember it. And one of the remarkable things was Edwin Cameron, who's in the center, is a Supreme Court justice in South Africa, and he stood up and he said, I'm a gay man, I'm alive, I have HIV, I'm alive because I can access the drugs. And he pointed to the audience and he said, you know, you are as guilty as the Germans in Nazi Germany or the white South Africans during apartheid. We can't keep doing things this way. Jeffrey Sachs barked at the audience and said, this would cost Americans a movie ticket and a box of popcorn to give these drugs to the rest of the world. And activism started to crop up demanding this. Out of the Durban meeting, there's this explosion of interest in actually getting drugs that are working to poor countries. The Global Fund is born. PEPFAR is started by President George Bush, improbable as it seemed to most everyone that he would be the person to launch this, but he did. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation starts pouring money into the Global Fund and into HIV/AIDS research. This is just a chart of what happens with funding, and this year here is 2000. And so you see from 2000 forward, the funding just skyrockets. And that's funding to get drugs to poor people. There's also the recognition that countries could make their own generic versions of drugs. They could invoke World Trade Organization exceptions. These are pharmacies I visited in Brazil and in Thailand, where they were making their own antiretroviral drugs. And the cost was $15,000 a year per person in the US at that time. The cost today of these generic drugs is about $100 a person per year in poor countries. And it starts plummeting because of these homegrown pharmacies. I mean, this is the QC room in this pharmacy with the trash can, right? That's all it took. And activism becomes a global issue now. And these are activists around the world that I watched demonstrate to get issues on the front burners there that had been issues in the United States and Europe for years. So I went global. I started covering HIV. I've had a great fortune of being supported by science and supported by several foundations, the Pulitzer Center and the Open Society Institute and the Kaiser Family Foundation has funded my travel for many years to go see on the ground HIV/AIDS problems and responses. And what interests me is understanding how each place looks on the ground and how each place responds on the ground. So I've been able to do these special issues about different regions of the world for many years, and it's been one of my greatest joys. But everything takes too long. This is in Cange, in Haiti, where Paul Farmer opened this clinic. This is the line to see a doctor. All of these people spent the night on the grounds of the hospital. It's in a small mountain town. I woke up at 4 a.m. to people singing and sweeping and cooking. Magical beauty, wonderful. These are not angry people. These were happy patients to receive treatment, to stay alive. But that's the line to see the doctor. And they came the night before. This is the National AIDS Control Commission stairwell in Rwanda. These are their documents. I just point out that that's what a lot of patient record rooms I visit look like. Everything takes too long. Everything's in too much of disarray. These are all images of people dying from AIDS in 2003 through maybe 2008. In countries that's India, that's Myanmar, it's Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Peru. Some of these countries even said they had free care available at this point in time for everyone. None of these people should have been dying from AIDS. Look at their limbs. It's horrific. Everything about it's wrong. And then we learned in 2011 the treatment is prevention. It works. This is a study that looks at discordant couples. This is a man in Pune, India, who's infected with his wife who is not. The study found 96% protection. It may well be that 4% were people who were probably having partners outside of their long-term relationships anyway, so they may well have been protected as well. But we get this idea finally that treatment, if you get to an undetectable level on standard tests, you're not going to transmit. That again alters the world, and it creates this movement of we can end epidemics. And that springs up all over the place. These are all people dying from AIDS after that point. This is 2013 in Tijuana, where I watched this man die from AIDS without ever having seen a doctor in a hospice. This is in South Africa in 2016. This is in Nigeria last year. That baby, that never should have happened. That transmission shouldn't have happened. That baby should never have become that ill. And when I see this stuff, it not only breaks my heart, it makes me angry. And I see it again and again in places that have access to medication. It's not about money any longer. It's about something far more complicated. Condoms are critical, but this is a transgender outreach worker working in a brothel in Guatemala City teaching sex workers how to use condoms, which I just love the combination of that. And as you can see in the background, there's a line of men at the door waiting for this one sex worker. And she failed in her test of how to put on a condom on the dildo. He taught her, but she truly didn't know how to properly put on a condom. Harm reduction is used spottily around the world. This is in Puerto Rico. I was at a shooting gallery there. I don't know if you can see the horrific abscesses on his legs. That was common in the shooting gallery I was in. This is in India, in Manipur. They actually shackled these, at a drug rehab place, they actually shackled these people to their beds. This is in Ukraine, where they did allow methadone. They had just allowed it in. Russia makes opiate substitutes illegal. If you prescribe or use buprenorphine or methadone, you will be arrested. It is illegal. In Ukraine, they ended up, shortly after I did this story, arresting a doctor in this town who had a methadone clinic because they said that he was illegally distributing drugs. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is still used spottily. This is one of the first people in South Africa to, that's me holding the light for the PBS NewsHour crew. She's a sex worker who was in a pilot project in 2016 for pre-exposure prophylaxis. She was one of a few hundred people in the country. The HIV prevalence rate in the sex workers in Johannesburg was astronomically high. There were only a few hundred of them offered PrEP, even though the FDA approved PrEP in 2012. And this remains a problem everywhere around the world. This is Shlabisa Hospital in South Africa. As you can see, there are patient beds on the floor. This is South Africa. This is not a dirt poor country. This doctor, if I had HIV, I would love for him to be my clinician. He's phenomenally talented. He's great. But that's what he's facing. And I think that's what a lot of places are facing, including you guys. I think your systems are overloaded. And the key affected populations, the marginalized populations, what I like to bluntly call the hated populations, are ignored often. Where I live, I did a book about the HIV epidemic in Tijuana. The woman on the left was a nurse in the United States who got deported, was a heroin user, lived in the river canal there. In Baltimore, Maryland, there are men who have sex with men who are highly stigmatized, and transgender sex workers in Honduras. These are populations that all around the world are discriminated against. And so what I've found works is really tailored solutions to each place. This is a village in Zimbabwe in the upper left that has 96% viral suppression in over 200 people for several years on end. And one of the reasons they've succeeded is because those nurses come every 2 months to the church in town, bring everyone who's infected in the village their antiretroviral drugs. Everybody gets weighed, gets their CD4s done on the same day in the same village. They're 5-hour walk from the nearest hospital. The hospital comes there, and it works. And there's no stigma to speak of. Everybody in the village knows who's infected, who isn't. They go to your door if you don't show up for drug day. They get you out there, and it works. That's for that place. It wouldn't work in Miami, but it works there. In Mfangano Island, where the search trial took place, I visited there. They set up these health day tents where they have testing for all sorts of diseases. It's not an HIV test, but they test you for HIV. If you're positive, they get you on treatment right away. Now they've introduced PrEP there. They had the whole community out getting tested, and they've had remarkable success in identifying infected people, getting them on treatment, and sustaining low viral loads. In Nigeria, which has very high mother-to-child transmission, this is a church that has they have a program where the priest asks all pregnant women to come forward. Those are all pregnant women in the front, sprinkles holy water on them, and says, after the service, in the back, we're going to test you for malaria and hepatitis and HIV, and it's just mixed in again. There's no stigma. It's not an HIV testing day. And if you're infected, they again aggressively follow up. In Port-au-Prince, this is a group teaching in Haiti, teaching sex workers to become dance teachers to help them transition out of sex work. I went to a mine in Botswana. I went down a half mile into the earth where they did the most creative HIV prevention program you can imagine, because it was a completely captive audience. There was nowhere to go. And this is in San Francisco, where the public health department has people chaperone people who are having trouble staying on their meds to their clinic appointment. Very logical. You need aggressive outreach, and you have it here. This is your program here that Hansel Tooks and his group have started with people who are injecting drugs, helping them get clean needles, get into the clinic. Washington, D.C. has this aggressive outreach program where she drives around and tracks you down if you don't show up for your clinic meeting and yells at you. And and she's frightening. And in Kazan in Russia, this guy shows up to your house if you're shooting heroin. This guy happened to be making opiates at his house, and he's bringing him the cooking equipment and everything, but he brings him bunches of big needles, bags of big needles that he hands out to his friends who come to him to get heroin. And so he's a distributor of many things. And this is a prison program in Rhode Island where Jody Rich from Brown University goes in and created pill packs for people because he realized that they would use them more effectively. And the incarcerated community has a huge problem when they leave prison. Aggressively outreaching to people who are released is important too. There has to be better targeting of how we do what we do. And you see places like San Francisco, and maybe Miami's doing this now, looking at neighborhood by neighborhood. Where is viral load suppressed? Where is it not suppressed? In San Diego, they've done extensive networking of transmission networks to try to identify people who are in social groups, in sexual transmission networks. And if you're infected, they then try to contact your partners and get them on PrEP. But I think one of the most critical things I've seen working everywhere is building trust with people. And these are both in Miami. The clinics I visit where they build trust with people succeed. And the clinics that don't. Patients who trust their clinicians come back. You know that. But I don't think that gets enough emphasis. And research remains key. These are broadly neutralizing antibodies against HIV. We know that Timothy Ray Brown on the left has been cured of HIV. There's now a second London patient who looks like he's been cured. Matt Sharp on the right is receiving a Sangamo treatment that tries to cripple CCR5 ex vivo. It's unclear whether that's working, but it's a clever idea. There's been extraordinary success with monkeys. The group in Oregon has shown with the CMV vector vaccine remarkable success, and Ron DeRozier and his group here has the Miami monkey, who likely has been functionally cured with an AAV vector supplying a broadly neutralizing antibody. I think those are incredibly promising, both of those. And I would bank on both of those paying off if they move forward into the clinic, although most everything fails. I think you need visionary leadership. I don't mean to single out Mario, but I do think that what I've seen in every place that works is there's a university that's helping lead the way to the response, working with government and working with public health departments. I think the University of Miami, in my experience in Florida, is that place. I think what you're doing is the leadership that this state needs, because this state is suffering. And I think if you guys can collaborate effectively with the government and effectively with your public health departments, you have the chance to make an enormous difference, especially if you can be self-critical. And that's me being self-critical of myself with that ridiculous headgear. And I just want to thank everyone, including the photographers I've worked extensively with, Malcolm Linton and Misha Friedman, and Science, and you guys all for having me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John, for a very inspirational and interesting journey that you've taken, and we hope that one day you will write that sentence that you want to write.
And thank you.
Whether it's for the New York Times or Science, we'll be happy to read it anywhere we can find it. And I thank our people who invited you today to give this very excellent grand rounds. HIV is clearly one of the major issues in world health, but it's not the only condition or disease that we have where there's significant health disparities, both in national and internationally. We have other conditions like diabetes, we have hypertension, and other conditions that equally have disparate effects on health and so forth. What were the lessons you think that was learned or are being learned now for HIV that you think we can carry as other diseases are looked at and other conditions that are looked at?
I think that's an interesting and important point. I mean, I think one thing, HIV gets a lot of people into the clinic at a young age who come repeatedly, and that gives you an opportunity to help them with their other health problems in a regular way. And in some ways, you could argue that having HIV at a young age may even improve your health in some ways for some people had they not had the virus, because they're going to repeatedly being seen and their hypertension will be dealt with and their diabetes will be dealt with. But it comes down to, again, that relationship between the clinician and the patient, I think. And if you do build this strong cultural place where people want to be for their health, you'll help people. And I think you know how to do that. I think when I spent time in your clinic here, the people seemed happy. The patients I interviewed, and I interviewed a lot of patients, and Alan, I spent time with Alan and his patients, and Dr. Colbert and his patients. They were happy to see they were happy to see their family. And if you can create that kind of environment, I think you will help people with their other health needs. And HIV overlaps with so many other conditions. It's not, TB is HIV. It's endemic. And, HIV creates so many other links to health problems when it's uncontrolled that I think it's an opportunity. Ask me questions. Yes?
What do you think is the best way for us to address the vulnerability that young girls experience now?
So, Africa has many places.
Well, let's say sub-Saharan.
Take sub-Saharan Africa. Let's take South Africa. One of the biggest problems that I've seen in KwaZulu-Natal, a very hard-hit region in South Africa, is the relationship between young women and older men. And older men who have money. Older men who come to the door. I have a daughter. If a 22-year-old came to my door when my daughter was 15 to take her out, I wouldn't let that happen. But culturally in South Africa, it happens. Often because of poverty, and the man is showing up with gifts for the family, taking the girl out for a meal, maybe buying oil, cooking oil for the family. It's an issue of poverty, largely, and of cultural acceptance of this disparity of sexual relations between young women and older men. And I don't know, honestly, how to really address that cultural problem. But it is a problem. And it's a problem that in this country, I don't care where you're from before you came here, it's not tolerated. We do not allow 15-year-old girls to be out with 23-year-old men. The fathers and mothers and the grandmothers and grandfathers react. And there needs to be more of a reaction culturally to that problem, because I think that's the central issue that's driving spread in young women. And the poverty. And then they refer to things like their minister of rent and their minister of jewelry and their minister of cell phone, because different men bring them different things. The studies have shown they are not behaviorally having more sex or even more unprotected sex than young women in the United States. That's not what it is. And Nikki knows this as well as anyone and has studied it. But I think...
Mario, John, I'm sure you listened to the President's State of the Union address,
Yes.
where he's talking about a 90% reduction
Yeah.
in infections in the US within 10 years.
Yeah.
How is that going to translate into a global impact?
Well, it's not going to happen. And I'd like to point out that Hillary Clinton was the first one who called for ending AIDS. I think he should be aware of that, that she first brought that up years before. It's a good thing that Trump is addressing HIV/AIDS. It can't be bad. Putting $291 million toward helping to end epidemics is a pittance. It's nowhere near what's needed. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. If he falsely creates the assumption that the problem is being taken care of by this action, I think that could backfire. But if this is a catalyst for more money and more action, that could be good. So I don't want to attack just because Donald Trump invites attack most every day. And in many ways, I think this could backfire. And I don't think it's going to work in the United States. But I think for certain places, maybe Miami, it could be a catalyst. It's up to each place to really respond with its own tailored response. And we see San Francisco and the progress it's making from a strong university, working with the strong health department, working with the government, and putting California resources into it. If Florida does that, and this is a catalyst with your CFAR and whatever else to help, great. I'm skeptical.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Appreciate you coming.
Pleasure being here.
That's your talk. That was really interesting. Thank you.
My pleasure.